بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Welcome back everyone to lecture 10. So inshallah 10, 11 and 12, the next three lectures we're going to stick with it. We're going to move to another tafsir. This is this tafsir called Ruh al-Ma'ani by Abil Fadl Shihab al-Din al-Sayyid Mahmud al-Alusi al-Baghdadi. So this is the famous tafsir of Imam al-Alusi, who died in the year 1270 of the Hijrah, which is approximately, let me give you the approximately 1854. So huge jump that we make from the last two tafsir. And I thought that it would be nice that in the last two tafsirs, this one, and then I'm still going to unveil the next one, the last set, we pick some of the latter ones. The late 19th century. I mean, this is somebody that we can probably understand how he thought, how he lived, understand the world that he lived around, so on and so forth. Al-Alusi is very much going to be a mirror to Ar-Razi in the sense that it's encyclopedic. I mean, this is in Juz' Amma, this is the last volume, it's volume 16. 16 of the tafsir, and you can see how thick it is. So it's encyclopedic, not like the one that Ibn Kathir is going to be different. Now, there's a couple of things that we're going to point out. Today we're going to do the tafsir of Surah At-Takwir, not all of it, but some of it. I want you to notice how he handles a reconciling. There's two things to point out. Number one, he's going to talk about wild stuff that no one we've visited so far he'll talk about Plato and Aristotle and Indian religions and stuff like that. So that's one thing that's just very interesting. The other thing is when he comes to do a tafsir of a specific word, he'll list some of the traditions, and he said some people hold to these traditions, but really when you think about it, these traditions are not a tafsir for this verse. I don't necessarily follow that opinion, I don't negate that opinion, but I follow something else because this is not directly a link. Those are the two kind of, in today's lecture, the two things I want you to pay attention to. So how he deals with it and how he will accept narrations. He'll narrate all the narrations, all the different recensions of the narrations, but he'll say, but when you think about it, this is not really the tafsir of this verse, it's for something else. So those are the kind of the main things that stick out for me in today's lecture. We'll begin this discussion in the next clip, inshallah. Okay, so let me begin by reading a couple of the verses, the first verses of Surah At-Takwir. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. إِذَا الشَّمْسُ كُوِّرَتْ. In the name of Allah, the most merciful, the most compassionate. When the sun is wrapped finally up. وَإِذَا النُّجُومُ انْكَدَرَتْ. And when the ascendant star plunged down, spent and dark. وَإِذَا الْجِبَالُ سُيِّرَتْ. And when the mountains are blown adrift. وَإِذَا الْعِشَارُ عُطِّلَتْ. And when full pregnant camels are just left. وَإِذَا الْوُحُوشُ حُشِرَتْ. And when the wild beasts are massed for their retribution. Okay, so pretty much those are kind of the verses that we're going to talk about. We'll see. The first thing is that he says that he mentions that there are different names for the this surah. And that's something that I didn't talk about before, but it's appropriate that we talk about it now, that there are different names for the surahs of the Quran. And there's not necessarily a standard nomenclature for the names. We have a standard nomenclature because we're all used to pretty much the same printed mushaf, more or less. But if you go to other places in the Muslim world, you will find different names, and that's okay. So he says, for example, it's called Surat. It's the one that's in the published mushaf is or what we're familiar with. Sorry, Surat At-Takwir. He said it's also called Surat Kuwirat because that's Ida Shamsu Kuwirat in the first verse. It's also called Surat Ida Shamsu Kuwirat, the entire first verse. So that's something that he points out that we didn't necessarily visit before. And then he says وَهِيَ مَكِّيَّةٌ بِلَا خِلَافٍ. He's like, this is a Meccan surah without dispute. I did not mention this when I did Ibn Kathir and Ar-Razi. They do that as well, but that's how he starts. And he says it is 29 verses. Yeah. And then in another tafsir, at Taysir, he says it's listed as 28 verses. Probably that will happen later in the surah. I didn't get that far in the preparation for this class, but sometimes some of the verses are put together and they're considered one verse, or sometimes they're considered two verses. So just pointing out that the encyclopedic nature of his approach. So he's going to say, these type of things, and point out that there's actually even a difference of opinion of how many verses it is. Not that the verses are different, but like for us as Shafi'is, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim is the first verse of Surah Al-Fatihah. That will impact how the other verses are split or not split later in the surah, for example. And then he says, this is by the way all like the first line, it's not even the first line of his tafsir. And he says, and this is a explanation of what will happen on the Day of Judgment. And he says, Imam Ahmad and At-Tirmidhi grades as sound. Al-Hakim says it's sahih, that Ibn Umar said, the Prophet ﷺ said, من سره أن ينظر إلى يوم القيامة كأنه رأي عين فليقرأ إذا الشمس كورت. So the Prophet ﷺ said, if anyone wants to have, to bless their eyesights, to look at Yawm al-Qiyamah as if they are seeing it in actual reality, in actual play, let them read this surah At-Takwir. And let them also read إذا السماء انفطرت, and then with a السماء انشقت. And these are the three surahs that go together that are in the sequence in the very beginning of Juz Amma. Okay. So that little paragraph that he begins with, I know it sounds kind of like why are you focusing on something so small? But I'm trying to give you, I don't want this to be a class on the tafsir of the verses, because I'm not going to be able to do tafsir in 15 lectures. It's impossible, of all of Juz Amma. But I want you to see and hear the different approaches. So in just this one paragraph, look at the way he's approaching things. He's talking about the name of the surah, and the fact now we have an indication that there are different names. Whereas usually people, I think it's typical that most tafsir and most mufassirs won't do that. They'll just say Surah Al-Takwir, and then they'll start with and they'll say maybe it's Meccan or Madanese, but they'll just kind of start with it. This is interesting that he doesn't do that. That he says that this is that there are different names. That's what I want to point out. The second thing is he mentions the number. He says it's Meccan without dispute. That's important, but other people do that. What's very important is that he says that he's indicating that there's a dispute into the number of verses. And again, there's no dispute what the verses are, but sometimes some verses are lumped together or they're cut apart as one separate verses, which doesn't impact the meaning or doesn't impact the order or anything like that. It just means that I see these as two and then you see them as one. That's simple. Even though as we grow more as an ummah in this sort of modern age, and the publication, the Mus'haf of Medina, the Malik Fahd complex, that publishes the Mus'haf we call it the Mus'haf of Medina. Probably by the time my kids are adults, it's going to be, if not already, standard. It'll be very, very rare that you will find another Mus'haf. I've seen other Musahif from other parts of the world, Moroccan, Persian, from the subcontinent. But now, because I'm so used to the Medina Mus'haf, I always prefer, if I'm at a mosque and I want to grab a Mus'haf, I'll grab that. And in my own shelf, even though I have some different Musahif, I have multiple copies of the same Mus'haf, the Medinese Mus'haf, because that's what I memorize and review from, and that's what I got used to. So I think as the future continues, inshallah, these type of differences will not be so noticeable. And that's why it's important from a teaching point of view to teach you, so you understand if you do come across a Mus'haf and the number of verses are different in this surah, for example, or others, doesn't mean that something's wrong with the Mus'haf. It just means that they followed a different opinion. And then he gives you this one verse. It's kind of like the trailer of the surah. This is a very dramatic hadith from the Prophet ﷺ. If you want a front row seat, using our language, to see what's going to happen Yawm al-Qiyamah, read this and the other two surahs in Juz Amma. That's everything that's going to happen. So he sets you up quite strongly then to begin the discussion. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, إِذَا الشَّمْسُ كُوِّرَتْ. When the sun is wrapped finally up. Kuwirat, to wrap. So he uses even, he says, أي لفت من كورة العمامة. He says it's wrapped up the way you wrap the turban around your head, the amama. So it's, and he says, وَهُوَ مَجَازٌ عَنْ رَفْعِهَا. That's also very important. So he said, and this is a metaphorical use about meaning that the sun will be removed. So right away, he's indicating for us this understanding that not everything in the Quran is going to be literal, that there are some things that are metaphoric. And we talked about in the principles of tafsir, and we kind of made an allusion to these type of things, that that's very important. Not everything is going to be literal because language is not always literal. Some language is metaphoric. So here he indicates that this is a metaphorical use to understand what's going to happen. So he said this is a metaphorical use to say an raf'aha, that it's removed from creation, wa izalatiha, and it's lifted and removed from our creation, from its place, min makaniha bi'alaqat al-lazum. So it's no longer going to be standard, like its fixed place in the heavens. He says you can also say that its meaning is يراد لف ضوئها المنبسط في الآفاق المنتشر في الأقطار, that its rays and its ability to illuminate will be removed. And he cites that other verse in Al-Anbiya, يوم نطوي السماء, when we roll up the skies. Right? So again, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is using the circular rolling up, wrapping up motif, or maybe that's not the wrong word, structure, linguistic structure, to talk about the end of creation. And then he just kind of goes through a little bit more about some of the linguistic meanings of the word kuwirat. So then he says, وَالظَّاهِرَ أَنَّ ذَاكَ مَعَ بَقَاء جِرْمِهَا كَالْقَمَرِ فِي خُسُوفِهَا. He says, most likely this means that the sun will still be there, but it won't have any, it won't be active, it won't be on. Just like it's there when there is when there is an eclipse, a lunar or solar eclipse. So he said, the sun will just like be turned off, and it will be cut off. So this is also an interesting kind of level of not necessarily supported by a direct transmission like we found in Ibn Kathir, but he's trying to explain to us what this means. We'll pick up the discussion in the next clip, inshallah. Just a couple more points about kuwirat. He says it. He said most likely it means that it's just off, but it's still there. He said you could also interpret it as that it's gone and it's thrown into the hellfire. There was another one. Okay, well, I'll get lost if I kind of find it. But the point is that he's showing you that these are possible ways of interpreting it. Some of them have some traditions, some of them don't have some traditions. The point is that he's showing you that this is majaz. This is the most important. This is a metaphorical thing. Now, what does it actually mean? It could mean that it's still there, but it doesn't work. It could mean that it's actually gone. It could mean that it's fallen from its orbit, etc., etc., etc. And then he gets to the next thing, وَإِذَا النُّجُومُ انْكَدَرَتْ, verse 2, and when the ascendant stars plunge down, spent and dark. This is what I wanted to point out. He says, Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhuma says, لا يبقى يومئذ النجم إلا سقط في الأرض. Ibn Abbas, in one of his narrations about this verse, said there will be no stars except that it has fallen completely to the ground. In another narration, he says, Ibn Abbas says, the stars are like suspended by streams of light held together by the angels. And when the star dies, it falls from the angel's hands and it falls. And then he says, based on this tradition, he says, unlike what the ancient philosophers said, the stars are not in a fixed kind of jirm, a fixed confined thing or space. A jirm is like you see this little note card that I use. This is a body, a jirm. There's a little bit of thickness to it. You can hear it. You can crush it, tear it, etc. And he said some of the ancient philosophers, that's what they were saying. So he's like, according to this narration of Ibn Abbas, it's not like that. He says, بل معلقة في فضاء. Rather, they are suspended in space, which sounds very much how we would kind of talk about it sometimes. And then he said, and this is nearer to what modern, at his time, 19th century philosophers, how they talk about it, which is what I just said. Because they also, meaning the modern philosophers, also say that it's an empty space. لكن بقوة متجاذبة لا معلقة بسلاسل بأيدي ملائكة. But the modern philosophers say, but it's suspended in space, but there's some kind of like magnetic relationship. It's not that they are on strings of light on the angels, like Ibn Abbas said. And nothing is beyond them other than empty space, what you see. So that's, I think, interesting. Comparing, taking the tradition, not negating the tradition, but also saying this is kind of opposite of what the ancients said. It kind of sounds like what the modern philosophers say. So in other words, writing at the time that he's writing, he's saying, well, the reader should be familiar with hearing these kind of arguments. And this shows us that, somebody like Al-Alusi, who was a massive scholar, it's a massive family of Iraqi scholars, rahimahullah, Allah bless them all, that they were deeply trained in the Islamic sciences, but they're also connected to what's happening in the world around them. So this is kind of how we would talk about verses. It sounds almost familiar, and it's not so long ago that we would find it odd. Then he's going to riff a little bit on. I like that word. I know maybe you don't like that I use it, but riff a little bit about angels. قد ذكر بعض المتألهين أن الملائكة قد تطلق على أرباب نورية كما في الخبر. So he said some of the theists, okay, people that believe in God, they talk about the angels. They say that angels are angelic. Angels are light-based creatures, as we find in the tradition. إن لكل شيء ملكا وإن كل قطرة من قطرات المطر ينزل معها الملك. So everything in creation that Allah has created, He has designated Jalla wa Ala an angel to it, to the point that every raindrop that falls, an angel brings it down. That's sort of how I was taught as well. So this, for me, maybe you've heard this or you haven't, but the idea is that if you think about that, everything in the natural environment, it's just a tradition, but everything in the natural environment has an angel associated with it. So if you think about it, when you're just walking about, there's angels all over the place that you can't see it. So now he's talking about the angels, and he said, some theists, meaning of other religions, say this, and he's like, actually, we have that too because we have this tradition. So, and that's the way he's talking. This is the way I actually talk in my public discourse and my lectures, because I'm speaking oftentimes to a mixed environment, Muslims and non-Muslims, or I'm speaking to Muslims, young Muslims that are have no Islamic background, they're just Muslim by name or so on and so forth. So actually, this is how I talk. So when I'm reading this, I'm like, oh, that's exactly how I would phrase it. Not this issue, but I mean the idea of comparison. And if you've ever read any of my books and stuff, you'll understand what I mean. And then he'll say, also, we have another tradition that the Prophet ﷺ said, Atani Malik al-Jibal wa Malik al-Bihar, that the angel of the ocean and the angel of the mountains came to me. So reinforcing the fact that everything in the created world has an angel. And then he says this is also similar to the Platonic forms. Al-Mithl al-Aflatuniyya. So the forms of Plato, how he said there were forms, and then Al-Alusi is saying, I understand from the forms of Plato. I'm not an expert on Platonism and Plato, but I don't think that that's what Plato meant. I think I have to be that fair. But I was also trained in the West, so maybe his introduction to Plato is different. But he was saying this is kind of like the forms of Plato. وهي أنوار مجردة قائمة بنفسها. Meaning the angels are pure light that are have they are in and of themselves alive by the permission of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I think that when I was reading that, I was like, oh, it's just like a couple of lines. It's not really much about the tafsir of the surah, but I thought that that was very significant because it's the comparative nature that I find important. It's impossible really for us to do our Islamic thinking and scholarship without acknowledging the dominant philosophical trends like Platonism, Aristotelianism, Neoplatonism. I'm not saying you have to be an expert in all of that stuff, but if you're going to do something like tafsir and you're going to talk about angels and light and power and this and that, you're going to have to be able to compare, because other cultures will have another understanding of angels. Maybe they won't know that it comes from Aristotle or Plato or Pythagoras or like some ancient Hindic something or other, but that's where it comes from. So this is a way of drawing the meanings closer. And this is a lot of what we talked about in the principles about abstracting words and thinking about the first principle behind everything, the maqasid behind everything. I would add, and the book that I read for you guys in the introduction, it's not meant to be an exhaustive book, but I just thought it was a nice little booklet to kind of introduce this lecture to you guys. But I think that that's pretty wild, right? That there's this major Islamic scholar not so long ago that's having this very interesting comparative conversation, because that's how people are going to be will interpret and interact with the material. So here he's talking about this to address the tradition attributed to Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhuma about the angels holding the stars with lights, saying, well, we don't see that, it's an empty space. But if you understand and you believe in the tradition, or you follow the tradition that every created thing has an associated angel, then the string is really how Allah Ta'ala allows the angel to act or not act and control those things. So he's reconciling the meta narrative here is he's trying to reconcile the meaning. He's like Ibn Abbas didn't mean literally that there's a string and then the angel's holding it and then he lets go to talk about verse number 2, but rather if you understand the angels like in the Platonic sense that there are these forms and they're pure light, then yeah, that would work. That's what he's trying to do. We'll pick up the discussion in the next clip, inshallah. Okay, so rather than kind of read through it, I want to jump to the next thing that I think is really important. I hope I can find it. Now I feel like I might have missed it. Yes, here it is. Okay. وَإِذَا الْوُحُوشُ حُشِرَتْ. So I'm going to skip وَإِذَا الْجِبَالُ سُيِّرَتْ وَإِذَا الْعِشَارُ عُطِّلَتْ. I'm going to jump to verse number 5. وَإِذَا الْوُحُوشُ حُشِرَتْ. And when the wild beasts are masked for the retribution. Okay, so this verse causes a little bit of a problem because, what does it mean? Is there resurrection for the animals? Is basically what he's going to talk about. And the way the translator translates it, the verse before it, وَإِذَا الْعِشَارُ عُطِّلَتْ, and when the full pregnant camels are just left, and then verse 5, and when wild beasts are masked for the retribution. So those kind of verses go together. So now he's going to deal with this issue about the resurrection of animals. So he narrates a hadith on the authority of Ibn Abbas, and Al-Hakim grades as sound, that nothing will be resurrected except Thaqalain, except humans and the jinn. وقيل. So there's a weak opinion that some will say that the animals will be brought back for qisas, so that they can have retribution, as the translator translated, against one another, even the flies. Any animal that wronged. I mean, if you watch all that nature programs, I mean, there's a lot of violence in nature. So some say that the violence that happens in the animal. I mean, when I say the animal world, I mean non-human world. I mean animal, insect, plants, etc. Just all that. I know that's not the scientific term, but not us world. That they will be resurrected, and then they will have qisas. They will have retribution with one another. And he says, وروي ذلك عن ابن عباس أيضا. Ibn Abbas also narrates this. So Ibn Abbas, we've come to see that there are multiple opinions and tafsir that are attributed to him that are quote unquote contradictory or opposed to one another or slightly different. And that's also another problem, not a problem, but it's another issue, let's say, that the mufassir that's encyclopedic like this one, is going to have to be able to reconcile. So he says, also on the authority of Qatada and a group, تحشر الوحوش حتى يقتص من بعضها البعض. So the animals will be, and الوحوش are just wild beasts. It's a very good translation. So الوحشي, the animal that's wahshi, is the animal that we can't really use or ride or eat or anything. It's just wild beasts is the right thing. That they will be resurrected and that they will have retribution with one another. And then after they take the retribution, Allah will say die, and then they die. Some say, وقيل, another weaker position, is that once they do that, the only animals that will be left are the animals that gave pleasure to human beings. So we would say positive animals, not the wild beasts. And animals that we find pleasure, like a peacock, it's beautiful to look at and things like that. Okay. So then he says, this is the part that's interesting. وذهب كثير إلى بعث جميع الحيوانات ميلا إلى هذه الأخبار ونحوها. Many people, meaning the ulama, the scholarly community, many of the scholars opined that there will be the resurrection of animals based on these traditions that he narrated. Now, unfortunately, he doesn't narrate them the way that you would want, like a hadith scholar to narrate them. And you'll see in my copy, I read from this paragraph. There's no bottom part. There's no hamish. There's no critical addition, or like the takhrij of the hadith is not there. So unfortunately, you'd have to go track them all down. I don't know. Maybe there's a better edition of Alusi. This has been in my library forever. It's just Dar al-Fikr. I mean, ever since I was a student, this has been in my library. But anyway, so we'll just take his word for it. I mean, I didn't cite. I didn't track down the hadith. But he said many of the scholars, based on these traditions, opine that there is the resurrection of the animals. And then he says, فقد أخرج مسلم والترمذي عن أبي هريرة في هذه الآيات. So Tirmidhi narrates and Muslim narrates on the authority of Abu Hurairah. So now we're getting like a actually documented hadith. قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم, the Prophet ﷺ said, لا تؤذن الحقوق إلى أهلها يوم القيامة حتى يقاد للشاة الجماء من الشاء القرناء. So the Prophet ﷺ said, on the day of judgment, every creature, every living being will have its retribution, like the sheep against one another. And Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal adds to the narration, وَحَتَّى الذَّرَّةِ مِنَ الذَّرَّةِ, even the smallest essential thing, smallest essential thing. And then this is the part that's really interesting. وَمَالَ حُجَّةُ الإسلام الغزالي وجماعة إلى أنه لا يحشر غير الثقلين لعدم كونه مكلفا. So Hujjat al-Islam al-Ghazali, which I think is interesting that he mentions him as Hujjat al-Islam, shows you the great respect to Imam al-Ghazali, and a group of scholars, they opined that nothing will be resurrected except the thaqalain, except the human beings and the jinn. Because nobody has taklif. None of these creatures have moral responsibility the way we do and the jinn do. إلا أهلا للكرامة بوجه, except what Allah Ta'ala for a miraculous reason decides to bring back. وليس في هذا الباب نص من كتاب أو سنة معول عليها يدل على حشر غيرهما من الوحوش. And in this section that we're talking about, there really is no clear Quran and Al-Kitab. There's no real verse from the Quran or clear Sunnah that tells us that anything other than the humans and the jinn will be resurrected. وخبر مسلم والترمذي. As for the tradition of Muslim and Tirmidhi that I just cited, وإن كان صحيحا, even though they are both sound, عفوا, even though the tradition is sound, لكنه لم يخرج مخرج التفسير للآية. It's not really a tafsir for this verse. ويجوز أن يكون كناية عن العدل التام وإلى هذا القول أميل. He said, however, it could be used, the hadith that we just cited, it could be used as a kinaya, as a type of metaphor to show absolute justice in Allah Ta'ala's creation. And then he says, وَإِلَى هَذَا الْقَوْلِ أَمِيلٌ. And he said, and to this opinion, that's what I lean towards. Amil. This is my opinion on this. وَلَا أَجْزِمْ بِخَطَأِ الْقَائِلِينَ بِالْأَوَّلِ. And he says, and I do not say absolutely that the people that say that there is resurrection of the animals are wrong. لأن لهم ما يصلح مستندا في الجملة. Because in general, they have a right, they have a proof text that they're holding on to, and that makes sense. وَاللَّهُ تَعَالَى أَعْلَمُ, and Allah Ta'ala knows the best. I thought that was very beautiful. I love that, the way he phrased that. And that's, very much the sign of a later scholar, in the Khalaf, is he's like, look at all these tafasir, look at all of these traditions. There's this tradition, there's this tradition, there's this tradition. And that's probably where somebody like Ibn Kathir or someone that followed that type of tafsir would have stopped. And he was saying, but then there are these, what are the conclusions? So many people conclude based on these traditions that the animals will be resurrected, and some say the good will be resurrected, some say all will be resurrected, some say that they'll settle the disputes. And there's even this hadith in Tirmidhi and Muslim that's sahih on the authority of Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu that the Prophet said such and such, He's like, but really when you think about it, like Al-Ghazali and others did, that's not really a tafsir for this verse. But rather it's just a metaphor for that there's ultimate justice. And he's like, I feel more comfortable with that, but I don't say that the other people are wrong because they definitely have something they're holding on to. This is how we find pluralism and plural expressions under the rubric of orthodoxy. And this is a very, very important thing that I want you to understand, that even though you find different opinions, you don't necessarily have to agree with all of the opinions, but we're not going to criticize people that are following an opinion that has a valid genealogy, that has a valid epistemology, that has a valid set of proof texts. We can just simply say, I see the proof text meaning something else, and respectfully, I disagree. I thought that was very beautiful. So that's it for today. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam wa sallallahu ala sayyidina mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Alhamdulillah, in today's class, we began reading the tafsir of Imam al-Alusi, rahimahullah, who died in the year 1270 of the Hijrah, which is, he died in around 854 of the common calendar. We are doing the tafsir of Surat Takwir. And obviously I've moved away from kind of like a line-by-line reading, so let me give you a summary of what I talked about. The first thing I talked about was really the first paragraph, how right away the difference is he's giving us the multiple names of the surah. He tells us that, and then he tells us that there's a difference of opinion of how many verses are in the surah. And even though we are moving very fast to a standard Quran with a standard numeration of the verses and things like that, I don't want you to be absent-minded to the fact that there are different qira'at and there are different numbers of verses. The verses are the same universally without any dispute, but sometimes one camp of scholars thinks that it's one verse and another camp says actually these are two verses, but it doesn't change the meaning or the order. That was the main thing. The second thing we talked about is when the major thing is when he was talking about the stars. And he started talking about theists and ancient philosophers and modern philosophers and the Platonic forms and things like that, i.e. he was talking about things that might be familiar at the time, and I would go as far as to say even in our time these type of things are semi-familiar in the discussion, to help give you a comparative approach how to understand the angelic forms in Islam and how therefore to reconcile, in this case it was the tradition of Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu saying that the angels are holding on a string of light the stars. So he's like, well, obviously not literal. It's just saying that, if you look at the angels the way Plato looked at them in their angelic forms or light, their forms of light, beings of pure light, etc., then that kind of reconciles. And I thought that that was also interesting. And then the second thing is we talked about the resurrection of animals. And we narrated how there are many traditions that talk about the resurrection of animals, but Al-Alusi, rahimahullah, respectfully disagrees, following Al-Ghazali and others, saying, I think those are just a metaphor of Allah Ta'ala, the Prophet ﷺ saying that there's ultimate justice. But certainly you can have that opinion and it's valid because you have a valid tradition, but I'm lean towards another type of meaning. And I thought that was a very nice way of how he talked about that, and that's a new introduction into our conversation of the tafsir. That's it for today. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.